Hey everyone, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today's episode is part 2 of last week's conversation. If you haven't listened to part 1, be sure to head back to the last episode and catch up before starting this one.
And there is a saying in parenting that you don't go on vacations anymore, you take trips because you're just parenting in a different place. It's not
that's funny.
Gonna be relaxing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I personally like the blend of both. Like, we were just in Chicago for the last weekend, like I told you earlier, and I was super grateful that I had visited Alyssa in New York because I kind of was eavesdropping over her shoulder like, oh, she just uses Google to figure out when the trains are running and how to get to the train station and stuff like that. Neat. I didn't even know that was a feature because I don't get to use public transportation here that much. So
yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the idea of like giving your kids that experience before they get too old that it would be overwhelming to have to do it for the first. Because I always think back to my first year in college when I went to Boston. Boston, it's a very different city than LA, but it's definitely smaller than Los Angeles. But it's still a city, very much so. And when I went, I remember really specifically hanging out with kids who, you're 18, 19, and they had never been to a city before. And so they just did not have the awareness of their surroundings that they needed to have to be downtown in a major city. And it was something that really stressed me out as someone who just had it as a sense of being aware of my surroundings. Don't be by yourself in this part of town. Be able to notice when the nicer part of town is shifting into a part of town you should be more aware of your surroundings and these like those types of things. And I think it's a smart and a genuinely good idea to give your kids that experience prior to living their lives a little bit. Once they're probably, I don't know what the cutoff is, but it does seem like there is a cutoff where it stops becoming a sixth sense, so to speak, of yes, I need to know what's going on and almost kind of like what we were talking about with books, where there's a certain point in life where books stop promising you a happy ending or stop promising you safety. Like the world will also stop doing that at a certain point.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to shout out to small towns and stuff too, because there are things to learn about being in small towns. Like if you are from a big city and you come to a small town, like navigating rural roads and stuff like that.
Yeah.
If your GPS isn't connecting to the Wi-Fi or something like that, just having a general sense of direction, which my husband will tell you that my sense of direction is terrible. But I can tell which way north and south and west and east are.
I cannot. So definitely something that...
Yes. See? Small towns. Maybe. But yeah, there are certain things about living in a small town that bring their own things to the table too, like knowing the value of not listening to traffic sounds and just being able to know what actual silence is. And I was having a conversation with a parent friend recently about letting my kids just walk over to a neighbor's house without an adult with them. And they're 6 and 8, so they're kind of on that cusp where the 8-year-old should be safe doing it, but the 6-year-old has some impulse control issues. So I don't know if I trust her fully to A, make it the whole way there without getting distracted, and B, look both ways before crossing the street, even though she knows she's supposed to do that. Because if you're excited, the rules change.
Sure.
But just like in my hometown, we would be gone from the time that the sun came up until sometimes we would stop at home for lunch, and then we would definitely come home for dinner, and then we would be out again for night games in the summertime when we didn't have school. And I don't know what my mom was thinking, because like that would drive me crazy if I didn't know we didn't have cell phones. Like we would bounce from one house to the next, and just like we just knew when it got dark out or when the streetlights came on, it was time to go home. And I don't know if maybe there just wasn't as much anxiety or if there was just that expectation. But thinking about that now, with my kids the age they are now, I'm just like, well, clearly they're going to get kidnapped if I don't know where they are every minute of every day. Obviously, look at them. They're adorable. So
they are prime fodder for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild to think about. I did not have that experience at all, but I do think like I always wonder if that was a product of the time or if that is a product of the space. It seems like probably a product of the time, but but yeah, I can't imagine. I get stressed like out as not a parent, but like being out and watching like kids get too far from parents. I'm like, who do you belong to? Someone could snatch you up at any minute.
Yeah. I do love the idea of the people that do quote unquote free range parenting, where they let their kids go to the playground and they have like a sticker or a name tag on them or something that's like, I am a free range child. Don't call the cops on my parents for letting me play here by myself. Because some nosy people will actually take action when kids are by themselves, even if they're of the age when they should be okay to do something like that. So
Not me. No, that's between you and whoever, whoever's involved. But that's yeah,
Yeah,
that's
right.
interesting. On the subject of kids, you mentioned before we started recording, I think actually, that your daughter is getting to the age where she's starting to read like
She
voraciously.
is she is a voracious reader. That is the right word for it. Yes. She is reading the series Wings of Fire,
Hmm.
and she has read the first 2 chapter books. She's having me reread the second chapter book out loud for our story time at night. So I know what's going on in the books because she's having a real hard time not telling me any spoilers. But she's also found the graphic novel, and she is just tearing through those in one a day. She'll read the whole graphic novel in a day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and we work on chapter books at night, and she's in a book club that I help lead at her school, and she's just like, that's what she wants to do with her time.
What is it like to watch your kind of like mini version of you do the same thing that you did at that
It's
age?
so delightful. She gets so it is so nice that she also has friends that are big readers because they can talk about their series and stuff. And it's really lovely to have something other than screens that she can kind of get lost in
Hmm.
because I am very guilty of not sticking to the pediatrician recommended amount of screen time for my children. Hello, we had a pandemic, so we got really lenient during that time with screen time. But the fact that she is able to read these books on her own and she can have an opinion of the stories on her own, but she's still at a phase where she's open to me suggesting things to her. Like we just finished the book Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. Are you familiar with
I
that
am not
story at
familiar with
all?
that one.
Oh, there was a movie made when I was younger that was in the same style as the movie All Dogs Go to Heaven and whatever
Okay.
that studio was
Sure.
that made those movies. And I vaguely remember the movie. Saw somebody recommended the book on one of the parenting groups that I'm a part of, and I was like, I had no idea this was a book. Let's read it together, and it was great. It was a great story. Yeah, it's from the perspective of we're going to end up talking about this book more than we've talked about the Dark Tower so far. But it follows a lady mouse who. Tragically, before the story starts, had lost her husband. She's got 3 kids. One of them Nope, 4 kids. One of them is sickly. The whole story centers around the youngest mouseling. Mouseling? I don't know what they call them. The baby mouse, that is not a baby, needs to stay warm and safe longer than it is possible that their family is going to be able to stay in the place that they are staying because it happens like during the changing of the seasons when they would move from one place to another. Yeah, so we just finished that and she was into it and I don't know, it's just really fun to see how the books are sticking with her and she's like carrying them with her beyond when she shuts the book and just thinking about their messages and the characters and the relationships and all that stuff. So
Yeah, that's lovely.
yeah.
It sounds like she's probably a little younger than you were before you started when you started reading The Dark Tower.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Dark Tower. I would freak out if she was reading something like Dark Tower right now. I'd be like, no, shut it. They're talking about grown-up things in there. What are you doing?
Yeah, so with The Dark Tower, I think also a couple of things that you've mentioned that kind of tie into that spark of reading for the first time too is one of the things you talked about was the idea of like how Stephen King talks about Maine and the romanticism of a world that you haven't seen, even if it's a world you can go to. And that sort of sounds like a similar experience that your daughter's starting to have too with the types of books that she's reading. And I'm curious with Stephen King in particular, do you feel like that was either the first or the most impactful time that you were reading something that described a world in such a way that it felt like you wanted to go there or you could see yourself there, whether that's Maine or a fantasy world of the Dark Tower?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm trying to think back to what other books I was really into as a kid and think if there were any of them. There was a book that I almost suggested, or a series that I almost suggested for this. It's the Remember Me series by Christopher Pike.
Okay.
And it follows this girl that I believe she's a teenager in the books, or I'm pretty sure she's a teenager, and she ends up getting killed very early on in the first book. And we don't know who done it. And but she's a ghost. So the whole book is from her perspective. And she kind of teams up with the ghost of another teenage boy who had died like before the series started. And that was another one that I have reread as an adult that I was kind of drawn to because it introduced me to ways of thinking that I had never considered before. Like there were I wouldn't say there were religious elements to it, but I probably tied it to religion myself in my head, just like because they're talking about like afterlife stuff. And I was raised in a Lutheran household. So like that, I came from a small town where, again, very monoculture. The big deal in our religious spheres was when the local Catholic priest and our Lutheran pastor were on a parade float together. Like, look, everybody, we can all get along. And I was like, wait, I didn't know that was an issue. Was this an issue before? So yeah, just like having exposure to the idea that other people can have experiences outside of my own and different thoughts, like, as a youngster, what a concept. But I don't know if I ever felt like I wanted to be in the world of the Dark Tower, because it is a dark place.
Yeah, I was going to say,
it is
it's not necessarily the
it's not nice.
nicest place. Yeah.
Mhm. It's dangerous and it's expansive and troublesome. Yeah.
Do you think it was the danger that attracted you to that? Like it being well described enough that you knew that it was a world that perhaps you didn't want to be in, but you were entranced by?
Yeah, and I think Stephen King has his own style of like what at least the images that his writing conjures to my mind is got a certain element of like campiness to it. And maybe it's because I've seen some of his movies too that I kind of conflate the two. But he likes to use different parts of sex as like power dynamics, and he likes to use violence to like shock his readers, and he likes to make these really big worlds that the rules, he will define them eventually, but you kind of have to go along for the ride to figure them out. And I think that was another part of the world building of this, that it changes as you go along because they're on this big epic quest, so not every place that they stop at in the story is going to be the same as the one that you left. So yeah, I think I hope I'm answering your question.
No, I think so.
I'm talking.
No, I guess what I was really curious about was like if it was the story or if it was like the way Stephen King writes the story that was what attracted you or connected with you in such a deep way.
I think it's the story itself, because I have read other books by Stephen King that I didn't love as much. So yeah, I would say that it's the story itself, that it was kind of his version of like the Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
I would say if there was a comparison.
Sure.
Although this one, he talks about a lady having her period, so that was a big that was a big departure for me, having that mentioned in a book anywhere along the way. Yeah. So
they don't talk about it enough.
Ever.
Especially in apocalyptic stuff. I think I would like to know how it's being handled when the world ends and they're no longer manufacturing tampons.
We need a plan.
We do. This is something we should be talking about more than we are.
Yeah. Things aren't going to do it forever, guys. They don't last forever. So like,
that's what I'm saying. Well, you know what? Props to Stephen King for thinking about the important questions. Yeah, that's interesting because it sounds like, especially in 7 books, there's an element of like answering. When you have that many books, you get to answer questions like that. You have space on the page to be like, what are we doing about that? Were there a lot of little world building elements like that attracted you to that?
Yeah. Let's see. So that book in particular was one where the character Detta, I believe her name is at the time, or is she Susanna at that point? There's a character that has a, oh gosh, I hope I'm not screwing up the name of this disorder, but she's got a multiple personality disorder. And so there are 2 personalities living in the one body, and by the end of the book, they've merged into one, and the one at the end is called Susanna. And another book farther down the line, I believe it's Wolves of the Kala. I believe that is where they're talking about her having her period and like having to take her rags and bury them off the trail and stuff. And sorry, audience, if you're not into that, too bad. But she ends up getting pregnant. And I don't know if that is why that is an element of the story or if it's just to kind of flesh out the story more. But yeah, it'd be interesting to ask Stephen King if that was his intention or if that was just like adding some depth.
Yeah, just adding a little bit of color. Color was maybe the wrong.
A splash of red.
a little dash of accent wall red. Yeah. My goodness. Oh, I've thrown myself now. I can't think about anything other than period jokes. No, it's so fine. We don't get a lot of chances to put them out there. So I almost feel like I should give every joke I've ever thought of. Well, aside from periods and how they can flesh out a world, and I'm one of the things that you said, I think actually at the beginning when we talked about like how you've experienced the series, you mentioned that you also listened to the audiobooks, and I'm curious about your experience with those and whether audiobooks are a thing for you or this made them a thing for you, especially because you've now moved into a world where that is part of your career, part of your life.
Yeah. I'm almost sure that this was the first series of books that I listened to on audiobook. I can't think of anything that I listened to before that, certainly. But yeah, it just brings another element to it. And kind of the ability to listen and hear somebody else's intonation and their inflections and kind of what they think is important in a sentence, in a phrase, in a paragraph can really either change the meaning or make you remember something that had hit you while you were reading on the page. That I think it's almost like watching the movie of a book, but better because you know it's going to be as good as the book because it is the book, you know?
Yeah. Do you kind of see it as like an extra level of performance to the book itself? Like the book is sort of a text that you're interpreting on your own versus like you're talking about intonation and kind of delivery, changing the meaning or the intention behind the words. There's an extra level of somebody being attached to it?
Yeah, I will say that I'm gonna say it depends on which book it is and which narrator you're listening
Sure.
to. Because there have been a couple that I've listened to that I didn't particularly care for as much as others, but maybe it's just my tastes. But for this one in particular, I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, who doesn't love having somebody read a story to them and reading it well?
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but if there's like a word that I'm going along and reading, and if it doesn't register in my mind, and I kind of have to puzzle it out a little bit, or I have to give some reference to it so I know what's going on, it kind of takes me out of the story a little bit. But if somebody is a skilled enough narrator that they can read it in such a way that it makes sense without me having to take myself out that way, then I get to stay immersed and get to enjoy whatever's coming next that much faster. So
Yeah, this is a bad thing to admit as someone who's in audio, but audiobooks generally for me don't connect. Like I have a hard time.
Oh.
Yeah, I really do. The only audiobooks that I've really found myself enjoying are like when I read celebrity memoirs and the celebrity did the audiobook themselves, then I feel more like intrigued by it because it feels like, oh, this celebrity's telling me their life story. Like Jonathan Van Ness did a great audiobook. Jeanette McCurdy's audiobook for her memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, was
Oh
quite
my
good.
God.
Yeah, it's a hell of a title. Book's quite good as
Yeah.
well. So like those work really well for me, and I think that's partially just like you're saying, like the performance, like depending on the intonation and the narrator itself.
And also with that, there's a little bit of that parasocial kind of relationship happening
Absolutely.
too, because you're like, oh, they're reading me their book,
Yeah, it's like
kind
tell
of.
me everything that happened
Yeah.
to you, JVN. I need to know. It's like a little kiki, a little fun. But yeah, it's rare for me for a fiction book, and I think what it might be is there's almost a slight level of like if I am listening to the audiobook, I typically am doing something else. Like I don't find myself sitting down with an audiobook and sitting just to do that. And so I will find myself missing really important things because I've half tuned out. I'm washing dishes. I'm on a run, or not a run, promise. Probably like a walk. Let's be honest
Yeah,
with ourselves.
casual stroll for my health.
Yeah, a little hot girl walk. But I think something about it generally I end up disconnecting just a touch in a way that I can't consume the book itself. Like I miss something important, or I don't get everything out of it that I needed to get to be able to say like, oh, I really hope whatever happens next works out. Except for like you're saying, there's a really good narrator to the point that it's almost like how I have to feel about like an audio drama or a podcast or anything like that. It's where the performance is so good that I actually find myself like tuned more into that and not paying attention, like, oh, I haven't washed a dish in 6 minutes or something along those
Yeah.
lines.
I will confess that when I'm like about my day, I'm usually listening to podcasts and not audiobooks. Audiobooks are usually what I reserve for long car rides. I went through a period in my life where I was commuting 45 minutes one way for a job 5 days a week. And oh God, what was I listening to during that time? I think I listened to the Harry Potter books during that time.
Okay.
Because then you're like contained. You're just paying attention to the book and the road.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I'm around the house cleaning or on a walk, hot girl walk, then then it's gonna be
It's gonna be a
podcast because
podcast.
I have to be able to stop that on a dime and to pay attention to my surroundings or
Sure.
if my kids are interrupting me or something. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the Dark Tower audiobooks, are they the type that did pull you in to the point that you actually like connected and did nothing else?
yeah, so I think they did a really good job choosing George Goodall as the narrator because he has kind of that mature, gruff voice that seems like it would suit the character of Roland really well naturally, and that the story is told largely from his perspective. And I think it fit really well, and he did a great job of fitting the style of the overall story too. So
Yeah, I like what you're saying about kind of picking the right performer for it, and to pick someone who feels like it could be like Roland himself telling you the story, because there's a level of almost like intimacy, I guess is the word I'm looking for, where when you're reading the book you're sort of crafting a voice in your head, and that voice, depending on kind of how you process things, could sound like your own, could sound like nothing, could sound like a specific voice in your head for this character. And if you are listening to an audiobook that does do it well and does pick the right narrator, and that narrator is putting their whole heart into it, then you get almost an element of like that character that you want to be connected with and want to be real, feeling a little bit more real, it almost feels like. Did those novels give you, or those audiobooks, I guess, in particular, give you any inclination of like, this is something I might want to do, or did that come later in life?
I think they laid the foundation for it. The thought of actually providing voices for audiobooks or for whatever my career takes me to in the future kind of was a combination of that and video games and cartoons that I've watched. Like watching Adventure Time, doesn't that seem like it would be so much fun to do a voice for? Like, they just seem like they're having a great time. And then let's see, a game example, my husband and I played Borderlands together, and just like another really fun script. And I just love the idea of a job where I don't have to dress up, I don't have to do my makeup or anything if I really don't want to, but I could get to play in somebody else's world. Or like for our podcast, I was fortunate enough to also be a writer in it. So I got to like kind of imagine what the characters would do and just create things for people that I know and love to say.
Yeah.
But what fun creative options are there in the world?
Yeah, I was gonna say, did that kind of desire to craft come from the joy of consuming, basically? Like the feeling that you had of immersing yourself in Roland's story in the Dark Tower, and then being able to provide that same type of immersive experience come from that enjoyment?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I going back to how I was like a blubbering mess in my chair, I definitely envy people that are able to make an audience feel the way they want them to feel and to picture what they want to picture. And I think that I've always been more creative. Like, I'm not a dummy. I can do math on some levels. Don't ask people to check on that just because. But I consider myself like a jack of many trades, master of none in a lot of creative spheres. Like I do crafts and I cook and things like that, but I wouldn't say that I am an expert in any of them. But there's often like that creative push of just like, I've got this energy in my body to make a thing, and the way that I channel it is dependent on how that feeling is how the whatever I'm working on is going to turn out. So if I'm feeling extra creative, and maybe this is a procrastinator's thing, I don't know, but like if you've got that, I don't know, it feels like a physical feeling to say, I've got all this creative energy, where am I going to put it? And if I don't have that creative energy and I try to work on something, it's not going to be as good as if I have that physical feeling of just like, I have something that needs to get out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I like that idea of sort of like the envy of a really well done story that made you feel that way. The envy of being able to make someone feel that way, kind of manifesting into, like you're saying, something that becomes such a physical urge that you have to get it out yourself. And I wonder if there's like that creative journey of going from being someone who consumes things and feels so passionately about them, if it starts with envy. There's something very interesting about that, of feeling something so deeply through a narrative and then just having the small inkling of like, I wish I could make someone feel that way, and that slowly growing into something that ultimately then becomes, here's the thing that I have to get out of my body so deeply. And I always wonder like, oh, like what was the thing that made Stephen King go, man, I'm gonna do that one day, but not even necessarily consciously. I don't know that there's like this switch that flips where you look at something and say like, this is the moment, this is the thing that there's the moment I became a creative person.
yeah. I mean, I had said for a long time that I wanted to do voiceover. A long time, I guess I can't give you an actual year that I wanted to start doing voiceover. It feels weird to say, but thanks to the pandemic, that's how I've gotten to where I am so far, is because during lockdown, there was a group that started off of Reddit that has a forum on Discord. It's called LTM. And it's just this really lovely community of different levels of experienced voice actors. They are really welcoming and very helpful. If you have any questions, if you have any doubts or fears or whatever, they've got different resources for how to learn different skills in the sphere of voice acting. And just a group of us decided to start making the podcast and make our podcast collective. And I don't know if I know maybe I'm jumping ahead to your final question, but if I hadn't read Stephen King, if that wouldn't have like sparked me to really appreciate the different types of writing there is out there, if I would have just kind of stuck to the more fluff pieces or the more safe stories and stuff, if I would have felt driven to kind of create my own stuff, or if having the anxiety and the uncertainty around the cliffhangers within the, not even at the end of the chapter, just within the chapter, if that would have been absent from my creative push.
I think it's really interesting to like look at. One of the things I've loved doing this show is seeing people's like almost creative building blocks that come out of life that you don't necessarily know are being formed. Like for me, something that we've done 2 episodes on Supernatural, the TV show from the hit CW television show that ran for 15 years. And I have since realized that there was a moment, and I don't know if you're familiar with Supernatural.
I've been told that I need to watch it, and I started trying to watch it, and it's just so daunting because there's just so much of it.
That's fair. I will not spoil the moment then in this conversation. I think if you're listening and you are familiar with Supernatural, you will be able to tell what I'm talking about. If you are not familiar with Supernatural, when you get to it, you'll be like, oh, that was what she was talking about. But there is, for me, the first 5 seasons are they shift showrunners after that, and the next showrunner does a very good job and continues on for 10 more years after that. But the first 5 are the original intention of the show's creator and where he was going with it. And there is a moment with one specific character that happens in season 4, I think. I know it's in that first era. But there's a moment where
first
now
era. How many eras does the show have?
A lot. But there's a moment where it's a twist that's revealed. And it's a very meta twist where you sort of find out that like this show has been about 2 brothers fighting demons, and it's already a little, out there and not grounded in reality. And then there is a secondary twist that feels, I remember being like, oh my God. And now looking back on it and having talked about the show so much, I've now looked back and said, oh, I think that was one of those moments where I was obsessed with this one little twist that worked out really well, that was so well executed, and the way that moment made me feel. And then that moment has stuck with me far past. At that point, I had no interest in being a writer. I had no desire to work in TV or to craft stories or to be a storyteller. I wanted to be an engineer. And so now looking back on it, I can say like, oh, but that was one of those moments where I started this seed of like kind of envy that you're talking about, where you say like, that was really good. That was really good. How did they do that?
To think up something like that nobody can see coming, and it's not been done before, and people can't be like, oh, I can look back and see how they were building up to that, and now it's really obvious. Or to have that look back and be like, oh my God, there were Easter eggs along the whole way. And just, it is so satisfying.
Those are my favorite. I think those are some of the best twists of I mean, that's not a new theory. That is, a tenet of writing, which is just that the best twist is the one no one sees coming, but when you watch it back, you've been telling them since the very beginning that was the end of the show, or that was the moment that was coming.
And they don't feel cheated, like you snuck something just to make like a Deus Ex Machina kind of thing.
No, you feel like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't see it coming, but also, yeah, of course I didn't see it coming.
So perfect.
It's so good. and you can't let go of that. And I really love what you've said about the idea of that it starts with envy. It starts with something that is done so well that it makes you almost kind of obsess over it and go like, you want to tell people like, oh no, it was just so good. When you get there, you're never going to believe it. And then you start to sort of remember and just build. Like it sounds like for you, you have that little moment with Stephen King with The Dark Tower, and then you start to see more and more things that fit into that same genre, and you start to crave this idea of sort of like we've talked about, like worlds where it certainly could be worse, or the anxiety of those types of stories and cliffhangers, and you start to crave that a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and then you start to go, well, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could do the same thing and give someone that same feeling. It's an interesting sort of creative path that I think we don't necessarily think a lot about, is that it starts with like a desire to do something as well as someone else did.
Yep.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that. Well, I do think you did walk us right to our final question that I always ask, which I'll let you answer properly with the formality of it all. But if you had never read the Dark Tower series, what would be different about you today?
Well, I will go back to my love of travel. Like I know that I still would have traveled, but I don't know that I would have had the drive and desire to seek out other cultures and other places as much as I do now. Just like hearing other people write about and talk about where they're from, or even just like a storied version of where they're from. It's intriguing and makes you want to explore. But also creatively, I don't know that I would have been as interested in writing and voice acting as I am, just because, again, if you can get people to care enough about a world and characters that if something happens to them, they are devastated. And I understand during this this entire podcast, I have revealed hardly anything about what this whole series is about in retrospect. Apologies. But please read it. I will, if I may, pivot to a gripe about the series. Stephen King puts himself in the series.
Like as
he is
Stephen
a character
King?
in his own book as Stephen King.
Oh.
As the writer Stephen King. And he is kind of a deus ex machina in, if I am saying that right, in the story. And that is like the one part that I always try to warn people about. Like, this is coming, just move past it. It's annoying to me. So that would be my one thing for the book series, that I'm just like, just know that that's coming and just get past it. It's okay. He's going through some stuff. He's working out some things. But beyond that, just he brings you along on this story so well. And when shit starts going down at the end and you lose people that you have come to think of as indisposable in the story, and it's just devastating when they're gone and they are actually gone from the story. It's inspiring.
Yeah. I will be hung up on the idea that Stephen King is going to appear in the novels as Stephen King. But
it's later in the series, so you can get through the first. I think he appears in the 6th, or maybe it's early in the 7th. But yeah, he's dealing with some issues from his past.
I'll put a sort of, normally I don't ask a second question after that question, but I am curious, because you brought it up, with something that is sort of impactful enough to inspire a creative journey. When you see something that you're like, I definitely don't like how that worked, does that keep you from making those do you think of the mistakes as much as you think of the things that are done well as you're starting to build your own journey?
Yes. I think I don't think it would ever keep me from rereading the series again, but I do think that it is kind of a reminder that you can love stuff that isn't perfect, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And it's not that it doesn't serve a purpose for him to have inserted himself in the story. The particular situation, I think, would have been more interesting if he had found a way to accomplish the same thing without putting himself in it. But yeah, I don't know why I'm being so precious about spoiling this at least decade-old series for the final book. Yeah, so Stephen King experienced he was struck by a truck, I believe it was, while he was writing the series, and I believe that was part of the reason some of the books were delayed. But in the last book, he writes himself into the story, and he is helping the characters, and they realize that they are characters in his book, and he is writing their story. And he says that his home in Maine, the world is getting thinner, and there are people in his stories that are wandering into his world, and that's his explanation for that. But the way one of the characters dies is they push Stephen King out of the way of a truck.
Oh.
And the character takes the truck instead of him. And I'm just like,
okay, so
and it's devastating.
So certainly a twist.
Absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. So
yeah. Well, I think it's interesting though that you think through kind of the same thing we were saying. Like when it's done well, it really pulls you in, but when it's done poorly, maybe it's just enough to make you go, I'm not going to do that. And I think they're almost both important on that sort of building block of your own creative, even if it's not a creative like a journey of making your own stuff, but just your taste of what I like and what I don't like.
Yep.
And yeah, to tie tie back to our existential conversation at the beginning of comedy as well. Like that same thing of your taste in what makes you cry, your taste in what makes you laugh, and how that can shift as you have your own experience. Some people may find that Stephen King twist is exactly their taste, and it works very well.
Yep. Yeah.
I could see how it could be upsetting. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you guys have enjoyed kind of our deep conversation about Stephen King, about taste, about comedy, life, fun, and are curious about Merete's creative journey herself, be sure to check out Lengthy Tangent and Peculiar Radio and get a little bit more of what it sounds like after you go through this journey of who Merete is.
Yeah. I promise the show isn't as dark as the Dark Tower series. It's a dramedy, so it's there are dark elements to it, but it's mostly a great time.
The only thing I ask you to promise me is that you personally will not make a character take a truck to the head to save you. Your character, your person.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Yeah.
No spoilers.
Right. Well, thank you again for hanging out with me and just for sharing and being so open. I've had a really good time to good conversation with you. So thanks for joining me on the show.
And thank you for having me. This was such a delight.
Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kumari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.